Welcome to SEC Sports Roundtable. This is your host, Shane Bailey. After a short winter hiatus, snow apocalypse, ice apocalypse here in Nashville, whatever you want to call it. I hate these silly names for storms. I'm going to start off on a tangent, I guess. So we talk SEC sports, baseball, football, but when did they start naming winter storms? I mean, I know they named hurricanes for years, but now all of a sudden you turn on and it's some winter storm with a name attached to it. Britton Burton's joining me. We're going to start off by, have you noticed that?
It's funny that you mentioned that because I was talking about that with my wife when what was the most recent, the Siberian Express or something?
I don't know.
It was something like that. It's like everything has to have an end. The one last year was vortex, which national media a lot term. I don't know, but yeah, you're right. We don't just have Hurricane Andrew anymore. Like a single weather event. It's going to rain tomorrow, so that'll probably be called then.
Well, but like you watched, I turned on the Weather Channel and it was like Winter Storm Matilda or something. I mean, it actually had a person's name attached to it, and I have no idea what it was. It was just so stupid I just bypassed it. But it's like, when in the world did they start naming winter storms? But you know, everywhere else in the country, especially up east, has been blasted all winter, and so Tennessee finally got their first blast of winter in 4 or 5 years this week. So we've all been snowed under and iced under and covered, almost, smothered, covered, and chunked. Let's go to the Waffle House or something. But I apologize for getting us a couple weeks off. We talked pre-show here with Britton. It's like it's hard to sit here and talk basketball. I'm happy to do it, but all I'm going to do is get on my Kentucky Wildcat soapbox every week, and I know that most of the listeners here just really don't want to hear me talk Kentucky. If they did, they'd just go to KSR. So I can appreciate that and understand that they don't want to hear us talk Kentucky basketball. But we're going to do some of that tonight, and rightfully so. I mean, they deserved some conversation, but outside of Kentucky, if your team's not doing well, and what I mean by your team, one of those teams that normally we think of, Arkansas, they're up there this year. So there's some excitement out west on the west side of the SEC territory. But outside of a couple of teams, there's really not a whole lot of excitement when it comes to basketball. And so it's been hard for me to get one together, and had some things just personally that's taken some time away and some extra travel in my schedule. So we apologize for that. We are going to try to be better to do this almost on a weekly basis. But let's get right into the thick of things, Britton. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate that.
Yeah, happy to do it.
We hope you're listening in on iTunes or Stitcher or YouTube. So we thank you for doing that. That's all the ways to find us. Just go out and find SECSRT, and you can find however you want to connect with us there. We appreciate any conversation you want to have with us. But we look at the SEC, and again, we talked about this pre-show about some of the things we want to discuss, and it's just like, for years, and even before this season started, we were looking at the fact that there is not going to be more than 4 teams again this year in the SEC. And what do you know, there is 6 teams by Joe Lunardi that's sitting there. That's sitting there going to wait. Britton, take off for a second.
All right. So I think the direction he was going is that there are now 6 teams in the most recent, and actually have been a couple of weeks, in the Joe Lunardi bracketology, which when you look at the beginning of the season and even several weeks into the season, the thought of having 6 SEC teams in the tournament, and honestly even right now when you look at who these teams have played, it's really hard for me to believe that there are 6 SEC teams that are predicted to be in the tournament. And then when you turn the TV on and you're watching teams other than Arkansas and Kentucky, who are obviously talented and exciting to watch, just the product on the floor, you're like, 6 teams are getting in? It's still hard for me to buy.
Well, it is, but I think it has more. I don't know if it has more to do with the fact that the rest of the country is down a little bit, and the SEC is still where it was last year because some of the level of play is not any better. I mean, you look at some of the six teams. A&M is one of them. They're not even ranked, but they're 19-7, 10-4 in the SEC, and they're getting beat right now, almost at halftime by Arkansas by almost 15 points. So you're looking at they're potentially the third or fourth best team. Georgia, I think, is one of the biggest surprises to see them in the discussion, and they've been in the discussion for most of the season. When you start talking about the depth of the SEC and it's getting, I do think that the quality is improving, and we've talked about this on podcasts this time last year. Is that's something the SEC has to address, especially with this SEC network, because there's live games quite often on the SEC network, piggybacked off of ESPN. If it's not Kentucky on ESPN, a lot of the other SEC teams are on the SEC network. So they have to improve the quality of the product that's on the court in the winter months. It's just the fact of it, and I think you're starting to see some of that. LSU has a great recruiting class coming again next year. This class is far above anyone else's expectations, I think, unless you're outside of LSU. But you look at what is happening in the SEC, and I think things are starting to get better. We've talked about it before. It doesn't take a lot of extra talent to really make an impact in basketball. I mean, you only have 5 players on the court, and I mean, there's been some Kentucky teams that only played 7 players for the full 40 minutes. They don't have that problem this year, but you're able to put a quality team out there with 7, 8 people. So it doesn't take a lot to get a couple of extra pieces. And if you're not one of those one and done guys, well, you're going to be there a few years, and now all of a sudden you can build some depth, and you get 1 or 2 players a year. Well, on a 4-year rotation, if you can just score 2, that's your 8-man team right there. The SEC is strong enough to go out and get and recruit 2 players, one would think. And so I think you're starting to see some of that take place in the SEC. You know, last year and the year before, we're sitting here talking about, can there be a 5th team in? And that team on the bubble was Alabama every year. And this year, you know, you look at them at a big win tonight, I guess, if you want to call it big, against South Carolina. They have a chance if they win their
Any win right now is big.
It's one they should have won. You know, it's a home game at South Carolina. But you look at them, they're sitting at 17-11, 7-8 in the SEC. Well, what happens if they do run off 3? I don't know who their last opponent is, but I know they have Vanderbilt next. That can be a winnable game. Ole Miss, and then a third game to wind things up. Maybe Missouri. If they win the next 3, now they're sitting at 20 wins and 10-8 in the SEC. What's that? So you're looking at that fact that Alabama could be sitting there again with another 20-win season and might be on the outside looking in and be NIT bound. If that's the case, I really think that there's going to have to be some changes made in that Alabama basketball program. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I'm pulling.
Well, I think the interesting thing is, honestly, the NCAA tournament has been so far out of my mind for Alabama for 3 or 4 weeks now that this is actually the first time I've thought about it in a few weeks. That I guess you're right. There's a chance if they get hot, you know, and win down the stretch, they probably need to win some SEC tournament games. Even then, I think it's doubtful just because of the lack of quality wins. But then on the other side of the coin, these 4 other SEC teams, excluding Kentucky and Arkansas, because I think they're kind of a class. Arkansas is a class above the rest of the SEC, and Kentucky is obviously a class above everyone. But those 4 other teams who are kind of in right now, LSU, Georgia, A&M, and Ole Miss, if you look at their resumes, Yeah, they have some good win totals. They're all nearing 20 or over 20 already, and will be over 20 by the end of the season. But if you try to find quality wins on their resume, outside of kind of those middle of the pack SEC teams, I mean, they don't really have any either. I was looking at this the other day trying to see, who are the tournament teams? What are the quality wins? And there just aren't none outside of Kentucky and Arkansas. And so, if Alabama were to get hot, I think Tennessee probably out of the question, but they're sitting at 6 in the conference, 14-12. So that if they have a run in the SEC tournament, they can get to 20 wins. Maybe those teams do have a shot. It's an outside shot certainly at best, but when you look at just the number of quality wins across the board, there's none that really blow you away, again, outside of what Kentucky and Arkansas have done. So it's not like these positions are just locked down, and teams, basically Alabama, Tennessee, that are on the outside looking in have absolutely no shot. It's just that from what you've seen from both of those teams, do you really trust that either one of them is capable of getting on a streak and winning 4 in a row and winning a couple of SEC tournament games?
Well, I'm looking at Alabama's schedule now, and when you got into SEC play, there is no win streaks.
Yeah, exactly. There's losing streaks.
Yeah, the most. Yeah, they had a 3-game losing streak and a 2-game winning streak. They started off with 2 wins, and then they lost 3. You look at the remaining schedule, and I was wrong. It was not Missouri. It's A&M. So if they can pull off and have a 4-game win streak, they're the only other team out there in the SEC that can have that discussion. There are 7 teams that can mathematically be in the discussion, unless you win the SEC tournament and your name's not Kentucky.
Right.
And you were saying Tennessee, they've only got 14 wins overall, and they're 6-8 in the SEC. There's no way they're going anywhere. And it only gets worse from there with Florida, Vanderbilt, so on and so forth. So Alabama's setting at 17 wins. Everybody else is at Alabama and Georgia are at 17. A&M and Ole Miss are at 19, and everybody else is above 20. The others being LSU, Arkansas, and Kentucky. So you have mathematically 7 teams that can make it. You're right. Alabama would have to win and go deep in the SEC tournament for them to make it, even if they had this 4-game win streak. But it's interesting to say that there can be 7 teams in the discussion, where last year we were looking, and the year before, we were looking at 4 teams hoping for 5. Here's 6, and if things get crazy, you could look at 7. I don't know if that would happen or not. I don't have that kind of faith in Alabama for them to be able to pull that kind of 4-game win streak, and then that would mean that they would have to go on a longer than 4-game win streak because they would have to win some games in the tournament. The good news for Alabama, I think, if they would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They would be in the top 7, so they should receive a first-day bye. I don't know if that's good or bad in their situation.
Yeah, that's true for them. I don't know that it is great, because they would have a better chance of maybe winning that early round game.
Exactly. So, you look at the SEC, and I think things are better. They're not great. We're no ACC. But, at least we're starting to get the discussion. Arkansas is getting a lot of respect outside of the SEC in the quality of their program. LSU, even though they're not ranked, is starting to get some notice outside of the SEC. And like you said, and Georgia was the surprise for me out of all of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I said it in passing right at the beginning, but I think you might be onto something there. You kind of said maybe the country as a whole, the NCAA as a whole, has kind of come down to the SEC a little bit almost this year, and I think there's some truth to that. I don't know. This will be a discussion outside of just the SEC, but do you feel like college basketball has a little bit of a problem? I mean, The SEC,
most definitely has a problem.
Okay, because the SEC is what we pay attention to, it's probably exacerbated to us because the SEC is at the bottom of the Power Five conferences right now in terms of what the product is. But when you turn games on for every conference, even the conferences that are good, outside of the really elite teams, it's just not an exciting product right now for the most part. I mean, your Duke Carolina game last week was a great game, but those seem to be much more few and far in between than what I remember college basketball being and what I've always loved about college basketball. It seems like teams can't score 60 points to save their lives.
I don't get to go to a lot of college basketball games in person any longer. But I remember growing up, I went to a lot of Kentucky games, and I remember that they would have an event where if Kentucky scored more than 100 points, you got like a free taco or a free soda. But insert sponsor here, and you got that by bringing your ticket stub the next day. I couldn't imagine them having that event going on right now.
Yeah, I mean, you could set that at 75 right now and feel pretty good about not having to give away, $50,000 worth of tacos because nobody can score anymore.
Yeah, but I mean, I know that there were games where they were in the 90s. It's like, oh yeah, they're going to get there. They're going to get there. They might not have. They could have stayed in the 90s, but they were in the 90s.
Right.
And watching the Kentucky-Auburn games, what made me think of this is like, when's the last time Kentucky put up a C-note against anybody? And
yeah.
And this was at halftime when they were sitting there at 52. I go, they got 52 in the first half, and you generally score more in the second half than you do in the first half. It's like there's a real good chance they could get to 100, and that made me think about that. And so yeah, we enjoy watching people score baskets, and there's just not the talent. And I don't mean that these gentlemen that are playing are not talented, but the talent that men had 20 years ago, 30 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago, they had more fundamental basketball skills. You went to camps, you went to camps and you had drills to learn how to shoot, to learn how to defend. Now you go to AAU ball and it's who can get the best dunk or the best assist to that dunk. You're not sitting there working all summer on getting better. You're working on playing as a team and showing off your individual skills inside that team. And that's a detriment, I think, to the college basketball landscape. It's got to have to be addressed. I don't think changing the shot clock to 30 or 24 is going to all of a sudden make them a better shooter. If they can't shoot with the 39-second shot clock, doesn't mean they're going to be able to do it any faster. It's just going to mean they're going to be sloppier and make lower shooting percentages, in my opinion. I like the idea that it's going to make them shoot. There's going to be more shots, more rebounds. That might improve the game that way, but the level and the quality of the game's just different than it was. And I think a lot of it has to go back to AAU and the way those guys are playing ball now. They don't spend all summer working on getting better and improving their skills. They're just scrimmaging, basically, playing ball games.
Yeah, I think there's probably some truth to that AAU thing. I think the easiest comparison to draw to me is, so okay, if you took a college football team and took them out of their jerseys and put NFL jerseys on them and took names off the back so you didn't know who was in the jerseys and put them on TV, two college teams wearing NFL jerseys, like you wouldn't, if you didn't know who the players were, you can't just watch the product on the field and from a skill set standpoint know that those are college athletes as opposed to NFL athletes. Now when you see them next to each other, there's size difference, there's strength difference, all of that when a college kid is standing next to an NFL player. But just taking the whole thing, the whole product, and putting it in an NFL uniform, I think you would really notice the difference. But when you watch an NBA game and compare it to a college game, like the level of skill is an astronomical difference now. It kind of amazes me that anybody gets drafted sometimes into the NBA because the skill level is just so lacking. I mean, no one can do the basic things that are necessary to make, an offense that has flow and that moves the ball and just the fun. It's just so obvious the difference between college level basketball and NBA level basketball, and I don't feel like that exists to the same level with football, and that's part of the problem with college basketball that's making it hard to watch. That just the skill level just isn't there. Alabama's the worst at this, but there are a ton of teams. It just seems like you watch, and for 30 seconds they pass it around the perimeter, from wing to point to wing to point to point, and that's their attempt at an offense. And then with 5 seconds left, they'll jack up some crazy shot because that's all. I don't know if it's a coaching thing or if it's an AAU thing. Like, is the coaching talent not what it was? Because the athletes are better than they were 20 years ago. They just don't have the skills.
They don't have the skills, and I think you learn some of it in college, but you got to learn some of those fundamentals earlier than that. And I think that's where the 15 years ago you were getting a different product, and some of it's just cyclical. Think about the NBA 15 years ago. That was a horrible product. That's when
Post-Jordan hangover.
Yeah. I mean, the ratings were horrible. The talent level wasn't what it should be, and that's when the NCAA and the tournament madness just really exploded. Was when the NBA was kind of down, and so there is some cyclical parts to that. I don't have the answer. I don't know what it is, other than you look at them and there is a lack of the fundamentals. You don't see a lot of those mid-range stop and pops. I mean, how many times did you see, even 10 years ago, somebody just run down the court and all of a sudden stop just at the baseline and just down a jumper and turn around and walk away?
You never see that. The shooting is atrocious in college basketball.
You never see that. They're going to go outside to the three-point arc and jack one up, or they're going to take it in and try to dunk. That middle of the paint areas is not being used, and maybe it's not as exciting. When you think about it, that game is not as exciting as watching them just drain a three or slam something down. But that's where you score points, and all of a sudden those points can add to the excitement that's already there. I think some of that needs to get peppered in. I don't think that you got to live in that area, but it's definitely a deficit for college basketball, and it's going to have to be addressed somehow, some way. And there's people much smarter than me that are getting paid to come up with ideas. I'm just giving you opinions.
Right, and you brought up the shot clock thing, and that's something that's kind of been floated around there. I think our very own Rick Bird from Belmont is on the rules committee, and what is kind of what you're not sure that shrinking the shot clock will help. It may actually hurt because of the lack of quality shots you might be taking, and there may be some truth, but I think coaching will allow it. Eventually these theoretically are good coaches, and they can. I don't think you go to 24 seconds, probably go to seconds, but anything that speeds up the pace. I mean, the basketball is supposed to be a game for amazing athletes, and right now it just feels like this slow, stodgy thing that doesn't allow athletes to be athletes. And so I don't think just reducing the shot clock is the only solution, but I do think it would help, even if they're taking shots that aren't great. Just let's get some shots up, let's get more of a free-flowing game. But there are other rule changes. I mean, they already tried the whole hand checking is an automatic foul thing, and it's like the players didn't seem to get it. They're still getting tons of fouls, which slows the pace down even more. The whole point is that they would adjust and quit hand checking and give more freedom of movement, and that hasn't worked. So I don't know what you do, but I'm sure that we're not the only one having this discussion, and I think that there are a lot of people that are kind of sad that college basketball is not what they remember it being. There are people other than us who are probably being paid to figure out how this can be better, and it's going to be interesting. I think that changes are coming in the next year or 2 years because, like I said, a lot of people are having this conversation. A lot of people are disappointed on the floor right now.
I haven't seen any numbers. I'd be curious to see this as far as the number of fouls being called today versus 10 years ago, 15 years ago on an average game. Because it does seem like there are more, and they're ticky-tack, wasting time kind of calls that just really do slow the pace of the game. And that can contribute if that has been increased. I don't know. You brought up an interesting thing that I hadn't thought of, but I'd love to be able to know what that statistic is and see if that's right. It feels like there are more, but there might not be.
I know this by big time at the beginning last year when they instituted that chip rule. Don't know. That leveled off a little bit now because they didn't seem to adjust to it the way they thought they would. One proposal I heard, the R out of the lane that's you can't feel and draw. It's automatic block. Basically, you can't draw a charge. They were saying in college that arc should be expanded by like 3 feet, and that sense because it kind of gets back to the whole shooting thing. The shooting is so bad in college right now that the defensive strategy, and can't blame you if you want to win. The defensive strategy is pack it in, don't give up driving lanes, and force people to beat you, from more than 15 feet away. And it seems like 80% of college teams can't do that. So they were saying expand that arc, and you can't just camp out under the goal, and maybe that increases the drivability, the drive lanes. So I think there's going to talk about those kinds of solutions that can make the game a little.
I don't know if I like that one. I like to see a guy be able to get in there and get a good charge. And if you expand it out another 3 feet, there's really not that opportunity for him to get in there. Now, I don't like the fact that, someone slides over at the last second, but, the days of being able to get set and take a good charge, that can really turn a game. I like that. You don't see a lot of that right now, but I don't know if I'd like that rule or not. But I don't get to make those decisions. So we are realistically, we're in the last week and a half of regular season play. Britton, as an outsider with no allegiance to the Cats, what do you think their chances are of winning the next 13 games in a row without a loss?
You were kind of breaking up there. So did you say what do I think the chances that Alabama wins all their games?
No, Kentucky.
Oh, Kentucky. I'm Kentucky. Okay. I think they're really good, and I think it gets back a little bit. We were kind of saying it's a pleasant surprise that we're talking about 6 teams, even the possibility of a 7th team that's in play to get in the tournament. I bet we wind up with 5. That's just kind of what I'm throwing out there. But how pleasant of a surprise that's been. The product has been a little better in the conference, but Kentucky is still so much better than everyone in the conference, and they are not perfect any means. They certainly have look limited offensively, but they're so far superior just from a pure talent. It's a lot of young, not up talent, but they're so much more talented than every team they play. The one problem is they still have Arkansas. Arkansas comes to Lexington, correct?
Yeah, this Saturday. Then they have Georgia.
Okay, Georgia. I'm not concerned about Georgia. Is it in Athens or is it?
I believe so. I'm pulling up their schedule right now.
Yeah, I'm not concerned about Georgia. Even they're predicted as a tournament team. Just watching them, they played Alabama just a couple of nights ago. They just don't do anything that scares me if I'm a Kentucky fan because they're not elite athletically other than a couple of guys that are pretty solid. I think Arkansas is the one team that can push you their post. I totally just blanked on his name. 10. he's a legit guy that can play with those Kentucky guys. Now, of course, there's one of him, and there's like 6 of the Kentucky guys. But they move the ball. They do all the things on offense we're talking about that needs to be doing right now. They have shooters. They can get up and down the floor. And you're probably going to play Arkansas twice, even if you beat them in Rupp. To me, it's going to be a major upset if that's not the matchup in the SEC championship. So, if I'm putting money down, I'm putting it on Kentucky because I just think they're so much better than us. But Arkansas is the one that that could probably end that if they had. And the thing, Arkansas doesn't have to be great and Kentucky be bad that night for it to happen. I think they're close enough that they can beat you when you're both playing a decent game.
I want to agree. I mean, I know that Arkansas beat Kentucky last year at Rupp Arena, so they have that I'm not scared of Rupp Arena factor that they've got built in. But you look at like the ESPN RPR, whatever they call it, their index to determine the probability of winning a ball game, and they've got the Georgia game at like 84% chance, which is like almost 10 points lower than the Arkansas game. So they're thinking that going to Georgia is a much more difficult game than playing Arkansas at home. And I don't see where that's. Yeah. I'm kind of like you. Both of those games can scare me a little bit, and you bring up a great point that they should be facing Arkansas a second time in less than 3 weeks or 2 weeks. You really get to learn some tendencies. That's going to make that second matchup, if they do come out with a victory, even harder. The good news for Kentucky is it's the blue mist will come to Nashville. I can already feel it coming down here.
Yeah, it'll almost be home court.
It's Rupp South.
Right.
All the Kentucky fans that can't get season tickets for Rupp Arena can come watch the SEC tournament in Nashville. And so I heard somebody, I forgot who it was, what kind of fan. He might have been a Vanderbilt fan, but talking about. He said he was talking to me, and he didn't know I was a Kentucky fan at the time, and he was saying they're like piranhas after their team loses. They're just coming out, just eating up all these tickets from these teams, fans that have come all the way to Nashville to watch the game, and now their team's out of it, and they're just going to go party down on the honky tonks. But he said they're like piranhas coming to get all these tickets, and I laughed. I thought that was kind of funny, but it's somewhat true. I mean, after a game, there's no loss of Kentucky fans outside of Nashville's Bridgestone Arena to try to get some tickets for the rest of the game. So he had a little point. So it will be somewhat like a home game for Kentucky because they travel so well in general, but it's less than 45 minutes from the state line, to the Kentucky line, and you're 2.5 hours to maybe 2.5 to 3 to Lexington. So it's an easy drive. A lot of the folks from Kentucky can get down here, so it's going to be interesting. I don't believe that with this team, and I don't think it's the case with every team, but with this team, losing is necessarily a good thing. You know how they always say it's okay to lose late. I don't think that's necessarily true for this team. I think they have in their heads that they want to go 40-0. I think that's their final destination, and I would be scared if they can recover or how well they recover if they do lose before a national championship, because they are so dominant when they play the way they need to play. I mean, look what they did even though Kansas State beat Kansas last night, Kansas was ranked number 5 when they played them. They held Kansas to 40 points, and it was a ridiculous amount in the first half. Number 6, Texas, they held them to 51 points. North Carolina, they played them great. They beat Louisville. I mean, they've been tested. That's the one thing that this Kentucky team has had, is they've had lots of tests. It's not like this has been an easy win streak for them. Coming into SEC play, I think it was nice that they had to have an overtime and a double overtime win just to get things kicked off, to say, hey, we can be beat. And that was against, two teams now that are probably tournament bound with Ole Miss and A&M. We didn't know that in January when those two teams played Kentucky.
Right.
But to have those kind of games, the close game against Florida a couple weeks ago, a good win against LSU. They've had these tests over and over again, and then they can come out and just have a dominant performance like they did at Auburn. And that seemed like, I don't know how much of that game you watched, but it seems like they found another gear. And I know that's hard to believe as talented as you're looking at this Kentucky team, and they're having a lot of fun. They've got a lot of focus. Their defense is just suffocating. And I'm afraid that losing could really, really be bad for Kentucky, because if they lose one, the chances of them losing a second time in the next 13 games is really, really likely in my head, because I think they're going to be shy of their mark, and all of a sudden, well, what do I have to play for besides the national championship? They're going to come in and they're going to be flat a time or two, and that's how they can get beat. So I'm scared about that. I don't want to see them lose, and it's not because I want to see them go 40-0. I do want to see that, but I'm afraid of that fear factor in the back of my head, the way that team is so psyched and so focused right now. So, anything else you want to talk about before we wrap things up here tonight?
Well, I'll just kind of back on what you're saying. Talk has been for weeks now talking about, is it good for Kentucky to lose? Because let's face it, it is a distraction. You get asked about it constantly. Cal is asked about it constantly. Players are asked about it constantly, and it becomes this thing instead of just focusing whatever coach harps on the next game, all of that. But to me, I would kind of echo what you said. I think it could have been good for them to lose a game if it had happened, at game 15 or at game 12, and then you didn't have this whole season of talking about it. But to lose at this point when you're on stretch and a young team, and a lot of the fact that you've gone 26-0 right now, is that right? 27-0. A lot of your confidence is kind of based on that, because you're 18 years old and you just don't know any better. Like, you think that's what college basketball owes you as this 5-star McDonald's All-American who went to Kentucky, and you've never experienced losing on the college level. So, if you lose that Georgia game, it's your second to last or maybe your last regular season game. And then you come into the conference tournament and maybe you get in a tight spot with a team like Arkansas, and all of a sudden you're just kind of out of your, things could just get thrown back. To me, maybe there would be some benefit into having lost earlier in the seasons, so this whole distraction thing isn't a part of your stretch run. But at the point, I would agree with you that whole confidence for an 18-year-old is an extremely fragile thing. It could be shattered by a simple loss, which really has no business shattering the confident team who's 27-0, but it could with many young kids for the core of your team. So I would just kind of echo what you said, that at this point they did go 40-0.
Well, even 2 weeks ago it would have been okay to lose, but at this point I think it's past that. I think at this point it becomes, it's 40-0 or we're not going to get a national championship if you're a Kentucky fan. That's my fear, and I hope either way it goes, if we do happen to lose, that we do find a way to at least win the big one at the end. So good stuff, Britton. Thanks for being on. I know we've had a little technical difficulties. We'll work on the final audio for the podcast to make sure it gets a little better and cleaned up a little bit, but thanks for being on. Appreciate that. We will try this again.
No problem.
Real soon. Try to do this next week. That'll be right down the home stretch for SEC final week of basketball. We'll be looking at the SEC tournament. We should have some idea of seedings by that point and be able to talk some of that as we wrap things up here and call this podcast done.